John, you wrote a story a few weeks ago. I read your columns for Morningstar, saying it was time for, you called it Sustainable Investing 2.0. You said most people want corporations to treat their workers better. They want companies to take action to limit carbon emissions, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of these sustainable funds missed the mark, you said. How so? How do we make these funds better at this point? Just give me a minute on what the point of that column was.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think it relates to what I was saying earlier in our conversation, that we're seeing kind of an evolution of sustainable products right now, because there's, I think, a realization that despite the continued high level of demand out there, investors aren't, when we talk about trying to figure out their preferences, yes, there's a range of preferences, but a lot of these preferences, if I could say the word again, are inchoate. They're not exactly incoherent, but they're just sort of like, I think putting the onus back on asset managers to say, here's generally what we want. You have to now figure out the specifics of it, because it's an investment product, it also needs to have competitive returns. And so it's I think a greater challenge for asset managers than, say, 20 some years ago, when real estate became, a more retail focused asset allocation, area for investors. And it's more straightforward. Here, you've got to decide, how to do this. And I think being way more transparent with what you are doing, focusing on impact was one of the things that I mentioned, as well as on engagement with companies. And one thing I think that's somewhat lost in the current debate about ESG, however, is that a lot of the funds, as they have existed in just the past 5 or 6 years, and grown so much and have so much focus on them, is that it has sent a very important signal to public companies that ESG is important to investors. And this is happening at the same time that companies are realizing this is important also to our customers and our suppliers and the people that work for us. And so we're seeing a tremendous explosion of ESG focus in public companies that investors can now help along, help continue to progress.
Yeah, and yet
as
it's still
investors.
There's stuff that makes people crazy, like this whole thing with Tesla being excluded from the S&P ESG fund. And a lot of people say, well, here's a problem. This is the problem. A lot of funds operating by wanting to include the best company in every sector. So they want to include the best oil company, the best tobacco company, and then they exclude Tesla because other automakers score, better on certain metrics like corporate governance. So most of these ESG funds, remarkably, include oil companies. So Occidental Petroleum shows up in a lot of ESG funds because it scores highest on certain metrics compared to other competitors in the energy space. I wonder if they score high enough to make a difference, or did S&P have a very valid point by excluding Tesla, for example? This kind of makes people a little crazy. There's a whole debate about this.
Well, here's the thing. Sustainability is complex, and there are two things that are kind of happening here. Does Tesla get a free pass for everything it does related to its environmental, social, and corporate governance performance because it's a leader in electric vehicle production, right? I mean, there's all kinds of other ESG issues now that come into play when you're evaluating a company and evaluating the potential ESG risks to that company and to its stock performance. So, there are these two elements. I argue that more ESG funds should combine those two things. A lot of them are kind of separating them, saying, well, on the one hand, let's just look at ESG risks that are faced by an individual company, faced by companies, and we'll consider that as part of our process and try to, mitigate against that. And in the case of this particular index in Tesla, they were like, well, there's more ESG risk there overall than other auto companies have right now. So, but that same index isn't really considering impact. I think we need to go to a point where we're combining both of those things, and there's a more overarching analysis of a Tesla. And so if Tesla is in the portfolio because of its impact, then you can engage with Tesla. Maybe it's a bit of a difficult engagement process, I think, currently with Elon Musk, but you can engage with Tesla about the ESG issues. And that's the same thing about oil companies. All ESG funds, they can make the choice, and investors can make the choice. They're not all fossil fuel free. They don't exclude all fossil fuel companies, all oil and gas companies. There's an argument to be made for engagement, for sitting down at the table and saying, we are large investors of yours. How are you going to get to net zero? How are you going to change your business?
Let me ask you, before I let you go, John, just to put on my strict investor hat, forget about what's good for the planet. John, is there any evidence that ESG strategies actually outperform non-ESG strategies? Forget about what's good for the planet.
Yeah, so the way I look at this, Bob, is that there's a lot of, I think, more traditional investors and even academics out there that I don't think really get this so well. They like to take one element, which is, say, an ESG evaluation of a company, and try to assess whether that leads to outperformance. And I think what they get wrong about is that these the ESG investors or ESG investment products are seeking competitive returns. So ESG is not the only consideration being made in these funds. There's a broader investment process, and there's all kinds of reasons why a particular company might be in an ESG portfolio that might not be related to ESG. It might be related to, how well it's growing its earnings in the next 5 years. And so the way I like to look at it is, we have all these ESG funds out there. Let's watch and see how they perform. And the story with ESG funds on the whole is that they generally perform at least in line with their competitors. Over the last 5 years or so, during this tremendous boom in ESG, generally speaking, they've outperformed traditional investments. So I'm not saying they're going to always outperform, but if you have an idea with your investments that, we need competitive performance out of these investments, I think ESG funds have already demonstrated that they can provide that.
Yeah, it helps if you own Apple, Amazon, and Microsoft is a top 5 holding, as a lot of these funds actually do. But I think the jury's still out on it, but it's a fascinating subject. The viewers are endlessly interested in this topic, and I am too, and watching it evolve is a wonderful thing.